On a snowy Christmas Eve, a powerful CEO sat alone under a glowing pine tree, surrounded by music, laughter, and light, yet untouched by any of it. His world was built on glass walls and silent nights, until a tiny voice pierced the cold. "I don't have a daddy. Can I spend a day with you like a daughter?" In that instant, everything he thought he knew about success, about control, about the life he had chosen, began to fracture. What followed was not just a fleeting encounter, but a journey of healing, second chances, and the simple, unshakable power of love. This is not just a story about a man and a little girl. It's about how a single moment can change everything. Stay with us, because what begins as a question in the snow becomes a forever home. Subscribe now to the Retold Stories and be part of the journey. The night was dressed in white silence. Snow drifted through the park in slow, lazy spirals, wrapping the benches, the paths, and the bare branches in a fragile hush. Lanterns flickered against the frost, and a brass quartet played faintly near the charity tent, their instruments shimmering gold under twinkling lights. Families pulled sleds, children laughed with cheeks flushed red, and vendors called out greetings into the cold. The square pulsed with warmth and life, but beneath one towering pine tree, a man sat motionless, as if cut out from the world around him. Ethan Cole was known to everyone, yet no one approached him. He wore a navy coat tailored to perfection, his dark hair slicked back, his gloves tucked neatly into his pockets. People recognized him instantly, the CEO who funded hospitals, the man whose company was on the cover of magazines, the figure who stood beneath spotlights at ribbon cuttings. But now, away from cameras and speeches, his jaw was tight, his eyes unfocused, as if he were trapped behind glass, watching a life he no longer knew how to enter. He had not planned to linger. Appearances like this were supposed to be quick, 15 minutes, a donation, a smile for the press, then retreat to his penthouse, where silence swallowed everything. Yet tonight he stayed, though he could not explain why. The carols rubbed against an old wound inside him. The laughter felt like it belonged to another universe. A heaviness pressed against his chest that he did not want to name. He was ready to stand, to slip away unseen, when a sound pierced through the snow. "Excuse me, mister." The voice was small, trembling only slightly, but clear enough to break through the haze. Ethan blinked and lowered his gaze, expecting perhaps a reporter or a volunteer. Instead, before him stood a little girl, no more than 4 years old, bundled in a faded red coat that dragged along the snow. Blonde curls peeked from beneath a knit hat that had lost its shape. In her mittened hand dangled a teddy bear with only one eye. Her lips were chapped, her cheeks pink from the cold, but it was her eyes wide, brown, unwavering, that made his chest seize. "I do not have a daddy," she said simply, as though reciting a fact. Then her voice softened, almost secret. "Can I spend a day with you, like a daughter?" Ethan froze. The words pressed against something buried in him so deeply that for a moment he could not move. She was not crying. She was not begging. She was only waiting, her mittened hand open, her eyes locked on his, as though this question had always belonged to him. A snowflake landed on her lashes and stayed, unblinking, while he struggled to breathe. Just beyond the girl, a woman stood watching. Her coat was thin, her dark hair pulled back carelessly, her posture weary but protective. Her eyes were sharp with exhaustion, yet within them was a quiet trust. Their gazes met, and she gave a subtle nod, not asking, not pleading, but trusting that he would not shatter what was fragile. "What is your name?" Ethan asked, though his voice cracked from disuse. Negotiations and boardrooms had shaped his tone for years, but here it felt foreign, uncertain. "Laya," she whispered, as though revealing something precious. He lowered himself to her level, his knees stiff against the frozen ground, his hands trembling inside his gloves. She glanced at his pocket, and then back to his face. "I just want to know," she murmured, "what it feels like to hold a daddy's hand, just once." The world around them seemed to still. The music from the quartet faded, the laughter of children blurred into silence. All that remained was her mittens stretched toward him, patient, steady. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted his attention, his approval, his wealth, yet this child wanted nothing but a hand. Behind her, the woman called softly, "Laya, sweetheart." But the girl did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan, wide with hope, too brave for her age. Ethan's hand twitched at his side. Slowly, uncertainly, it rose, hovering just above hers, inches apart, trembling. And for the first time in years, something cracked inside him, not with noise, but like a hairline fracture spreading through stone. A memory surfaced unbidden, a hospital room, a blurred ultrasound photo. A voice he had lost. He blinked hard, but the image did not leave. He did not know this girl. He did not know her mother. Yet in that moment, he realized how much he had starved for something unpolished, something real. His fingers brushed the air between them, and when her mitten shifted closer, he nearly forgot how to breathe. The music swelled again, but he barely heard it. What filled his chest was not sound, but a pulse he had thought was long dead. Later that night, back in his penthouse, Ethan could still feel the echo of her request. The city lights glared against glass, but the apartment was barren, sterile, no pictures on the walls. No sign of a life lived, only silence pressed against silence. He removed his gloves one finger at a time, placed them neatly on the table beside his keys, and stood in the middle of the vast space, a stranger in his own home. When he opened his laptop, his own face stared back from a news photo, him at the charity event, stiff beneath the lights. And there, almost out of frame, was a child in a red coat, teddy in hand, looking up at him. The picture had not captured her question, but he could still hear it, as if whispered into the walls. "Can I spend a day with you, like a daughter?" He closed the laptop, but the silence was louder now. Drawn by something he had buried, he crossed into his closet and slid open a hidden drawer. There, tucked beneath forgotten ties, was a worn envelope. He opened it slowly, reverently, and pulled out the faded ultrasound. 12 weeks. A shape barely formed, but one that had once shifted his world entirely. He had held his fiancée's hand and smiled that day, believing he was about to step into a future full of life. But the future had been taken. The grief had built walls so high that no one could touch him again. Until now. Until a child, with snow in her lashes, asked for a father's hand. He sat in silence, the photo trembling in his grip, his throat tight. For the first time in years, his mind would not return to spreadsheets or strategies. It returned instead to a girl in the snow, waiting without fear, asking only to belong. The following days did not follow the pattern Ethan Cole had lived by for years. His schedule had always been polished and predictable, a machine of meetings, negotiations, and deadlines. But since the night in the park, something unsettled him, something that pulled him out of the pristine rhythm and back into a world he thought he had lost. He found himself driving streets he had never driven before, hesitating outside neighborhoods where he did not belong, wondering what he might find if he allowed himself to stop. It was a cold Saturday morning when he saw Rachel struggling with the wheel of her flower cart. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hair tied in a messy knot, her breath visible in the sharp air. Beside her, Laya sat cross-legged on the curb, doodling hearts into the snow with a stick, her one-eyed teddy resting in her lap like a silent guardian. Ethan had been sitting in his car across the street, watching longer than he admitted. His assistant had already texted him reminders about meetings, calls, and lunches. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the image of a woman fighting rust with her bare hands and a child humming softly into the wind. He stepped out of his SUV and crossed the street, boots crunching against salted pavement. Rachel looked up in surprise, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked. He crouched beside the cart, brushing snow from his gloves. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, though they both knew men like him did not wander into these streets by chance. He ran his hands along the broken axle, nodding. "This needs more than just tightening. It is cracked in 2 places." She exhaled sharply. "I know, but $200 for repairs is $200 I do not have." Ethan looked at her and then back at the cart. "Good thing I am not charging." She blinked, uncertain if he was serious. He simply returned to the SUV, retrieved a toolkit from his trunk, and began to work with a quiet determination that surprised even himself. Within 20 minutes, the cart stood sturdier than it had in years. Laya clapped, her eyes wide. "You fixed it, Mr. Ethan." He smiled, brushing the dust from his fingers. "We cannot have your flowers falling in the street, can we?" The girl skipped toward him, slipping her small hand into his without hesitation. "Mommy says you are like a real-life helper elf," she said with pride. He chuckled, shaking his head. "An elf in a navy coat? That is a new one." Then, with a sudden impulse, he reached behind him and revealed a paper bag. Inside was a pair of red fur-lined boots, small enough to fit only her. Laya gasped and tugged off her old shoes immediately, sliding into them with joy. "They feel like clouds," she whispered. Rachel's voice softened. "You did not have to." Ethan met her eyes. "I know, but I wanted to." That was how it began, with small gestures, with quiet moments. A bouquet of daffodils wrapped in brown paper, chosen because he had searched for the design Rachel once made years ago. Groceries left on the porch without explanation. Pencils and crayons for Laya, always wrapped with the same plain simplicity. He started arriving not as a guest, but as someone who repaired what was broken, someone who listened when Rachel was tired, someone who sat on the floor with a little girl and built castles out of cardboard. He still returned to his penthouse each night, but the walls did not feel the same. The silence was heavier now, no longer protective but suffocating. Rachel noticed the change. At first, she watched him with suspicion, her eyes sharp, her posture careful. She had been left too many times to trust easily. But Ethan did not disappear after a kind gesture. He returned. He fixed the hinge on the back door. He replaced a flickering bulb. He picked Laya up from preschool when Rachel was working late. He never stayed too long, but he always came back. Over time, the defenses she had built began to shift, not because of speeches or promises, but because of presence. One evening, Rachel walked into the living room and found him holding the small music box he had left on her doorstep. Its tune had long stopped playing, but he sat with it in his hands, turning it gently. His eyes were distant, unfocused. She asked softly, "Ethan, are you all right?" He blinked and set it down, as if caught. "Just thinking." She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She did not push. She only said, "You do not have to tell me, but I am here if you ever want to." Something in his quote. Expression shifted, the usual control giving way. After a long silence, he admitted, "I was supposed to be a father once." His voice was low, steady, but behind it was an ocean. Rachel did not gasp. She did not ask questions. She simply placed her hand over his and let silence say what words could not. For Laya, the changes felt natural. She began to call him E at first, the nickname slipping from her lips without thought. Soon it became her habit, her declaration. She would run to him, shouting, "E is here." She would braid his hair with glittery clips while he answered emails on the floor, laughing when he pretended to wince. She drew pictures of the three of them together herself, her mother, and Ethan, always holding hands, always smiling. Each picture cut through Ethan's defenses like nothing else could. He tucked them away carefully, alongside the ultrasound photo he had kept hidden for over a decade. For the first time, the past and the present lived side by side in his pocket. But not everything was gentle. There were nights when Rachel's laughter faded quickly into silence, when her gaze lingered on the door as though expecting someone else to walk in. There were moments when Ethan sat in his SUV outside her apartment, staring at his reflection in the glass, unsure if he was strong enough to stay. He had built his life on control, on never letting anyone inside. Yet here, with a woman who had carried her world alone, and a child who asked for nothing more than a hand, control no longer mattered. What mattered was staying. One rainy afternoon, Rachel confessed quietly, "I do not usually let strangers in." Ethan replied, "I do not usually visit." It was not romance, not at first. It was something simpler, raw. Two people recognizing the walls in each other and deciding, carefully, to put them down. And in between them, a child who believed in magic, who believed snowflakes carried wishes, who believed that if she called someone, Daddy, they would not leave. That was the fear Rachel carried most. She had seen men walk away, seen family disappear, seen promises dissolve. Yet, Ethan stayed. He stayed when it was inconvenient. He stayed when silence pressed between them. He stayed when the past clawed at him in the quiet hours. And with each day, with each small act, the rhythm of 3 lives began to form, fragile, imperfect, but real. The fragile peace that had settled over their days did not last without challenge. It was late afternoon when Rachel opened her door and froze. On the porch stood a man she had hoped never to see again. His leather jacket was the same, his smirk unchanged, but there was something sharper in his eyes, a coldness that unsettled the air. He leaned against the frame as if the years had not passed. "Long time, Rachel," he drawled. "Heard you have got a new man playing house. Thought I should stop by, see my daughter." Rachel's hand tightened on the door. "She is not your daughter," she said flatly. He only chuckled, tapping the manila envelope in his hand. "I signed the birth certificate, did not I?" That night, the apartment felt heavier than ever. Papers lay scattered across the table, filled with threats of custody and demands for control. Rachel's voice was quiet when she finally said, "I did not think he would come back. Not after all this time." Ethan sat across from her, reading the lines, his jaw tense. "Do you want me to call someone? I have attorneys." She shook her head, sharper than she intended, then softened. "No, this is mine to fight. But I cannot let him near her again." Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She had carried too much alone to cry now. Ethan leaned back, troubled. "What does he want?" Rachel's voice faltered. "Control, not love, never love." For the first time in weeks, Ethan left quickly, but he did not go far. He drove in circles, his headlights tracing the same streets again and again. He stared at the papers she had copied for him, his thoughts tangled. He had promised himself to stay, but fear pressed at him. Fear that he was not enough. Fear that his presence would bring more harm than good. He sat in the silent car until dawn began to gray the horizon. The next morning, snow returned in thick swirls. Rachel woke to the sound of coughing, deeper and rougher than before. Laya's cheeks burned, her small body weak beneath the quilt. Rachel's hands shook as she dialed the clinic, but no one answered. Her panic rose, her words stumbling as she tried to dress her daughter, but Laya's limbs were limp. Then the door burst open. Ethan stood there, snow in his hair, urgency in his eyes. "I had a feeling," he said. "I could not sleep." Rachel did not argue. She simply whispered, "She is burning up." Without hesitation, he wrapped Laya in blankets, whispering her name, keeping her awake as he carried her to the car. The SUV cut through the icy streets, hazard lights flashing as snow blurred the world outside. At urgent care, nurses rushed her inside, machines humming, oxygen hissing. Rachel sat curled in a chair, her face pale with exhaustion. Ethan stood at Laya's side, both of her small hands enclosed in his voice steady, though his chest felt ready to collapse. "I am here, kiddo. I am not leaving." Hours dragged like years. At last, a doctor entered and said the fever was stabilizing. Relief hit Ethan so sharply his shoulders sagged. Rachel stood, her body trembling, and without a word he wrapped an arm around her. She leaned into him, not out of weakness, but because she no longer had to hold the weight alone. That night, when the lights dimmed, Ethan stayed by the bed, while Rachel slept in a chair. Laya stirred, her voice faint, fragile. "Daddy came back," she whispered in her haze. Ethan's breath caught. He bent closer. "I am here, sweetheart. I am not going anywhere." Rachel opened her eyes, just enough to see them, her chest aching with both fear and something new, trust. In the days that followed, as Laya's strength returned, Rachel finally spoke words she had buried. "I do not want her to lose you." Ethan looked up from the picture book he had been holding. "You are not going to lose me," he said. "No," she whispered, stepping closer. "Not me. Her." She explained how men had come and gone, how promises had always crumbled. He listened, and then he answered with something she did not expect. "I did not just stay because she needed me. I stayed because I needed you too." It was not long after that Ethan revealed something of his own. He brought Rachel a folder, legal documents prepared with the help of his attorney. "If anything ever happens to you, I want to be there for her. Officially. No matter what." Rachel's hands trembled as she took the papers. She had lived so long guarded. But this was not just words. It was proof that he was all in. Weeks passed, and Ethan drove them to a boarded-up flower shop on Belmont Street. Its windows were dusty, its sign faded. Rachel looked around in confusion. "What is this?" Ethan pulled a key from his coat pocket. A second chance. Inside, the space was cold and broken, but sunlight streamed through the upper panes. Shelves stood crooked, the counter worn with time. Rachel whispered, "This used to be my dream." Ethan nodded. "I know. I read about it once. You said you wanted flowers to mean something. I thought maybe we could bring it back together. You as the heart, me as the quiet partner." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him. "You are serious?" He nodded. "We will call it the Bloom Room. A shop, yes, but more than that. A place for families, for children, for hope." They began to restore it together. Laya skipped through the dust, marking the windows with stars drawn in fog. Ethan rolled up his sleeves, hammering shelves back into place. Rachel found old sketches she had not opened in years, her hands trembling with both fear and joy. They sang to an old radio, laughed when the heater rattled awake, painted walls until their arms ached. Slowly, the shop filled with life. Not perfect, not polished, but alive. One evening after weeks of work, they sat on the floor of the shop, backs against the wall, Laya asleep nearby under fairy lights strung across the ceiling. Rachel turned to him, her voice soft. "You have given her more than just stability. You have given her joy." Ethan met her gaze. "And you have given me something too." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was full of everything unspoken. Then he asked quietly, "Would it be all right if I stayed forever?" Rachel's eyes filled, her fingers trembling as she reached for his hand. Before she could answer, a sleepy voice called from across the room. "Only if you read bedtime stories too." They both laughed, soft and unguarded, and in that sound was the beginning of something whole. Snow returned once more, falling thick over rooftops and trees, but this time it did not feel lonely. Their days found rhythm in shared meals, small joys, and laughter that came easily. The Bloom Room opened its doors, not just as a shop, but as a sanctuary. A place where single parents found comfort, where children planted seeds and drew pictures on Saturdays, where flowers and warmth filled the air, and in the center of it all stood Ethan, Rachel, and Laya. No longer fragments, no longer strangers, but a family built not by chance but by choice. There are stories that begin quietly, almost like a whisper in the snow, and yet they carry enough power to reshape an entire life. Ethan Cole was a man who had everything the world said should matter: wealth, influence, prestige. Yet he lived behind walls so high, even he had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by something real. And then, on one silent night, a child reached out her mittened hand and asked the simplest, most impossible question: "Can I spend a day with you like a daughter?" That single moment became the key that unlocked the fortress around his heart. From that day forward, Ethan discovered that healing does not come in grand gestures, but in the quiet constancy of showing up. It came in fixing a broken flower cart, in kneeling to catch a child who ran into his arms, in giving Rachel the space to breathe after years of carrying too much alone. It came in hospital nights, in whispered promises, in the courage to stay when leaving would have been easier. What began as a request for a day transformed into a bond strong enough to withstand the past, the storms, and even the shadows of fear. Rachel, too, found that trust can return when someone proves themselves with presence, not words. She had been abandoned, disappointed, left to pick up pieces alone. Yet Ethan stayed not because he was asked to, but because he needed to. In choosing to stay, he rebuilt not only her faith in others, but also her own belief that dreams, once lost, could bloom again. Together, they revived her flower shop, creating not just a business, but a haven for those who needed to be reminded of beauty, resilience, and hope. And Laya, the little girl who dared to ask for a father, became the heart that bound them all. Her laughter, her drawings, her boundless belief that love could be chosen, gave Ethan and Rachel the courage to believe it too. She reminded them both that family is not always written in blood, but in the moments we decide to hold one another's hands and never let go. 1 year later, as snow fell once more, the three of them sat beneath the same lights where it had all begun. But this time, they were not strangers. They were a family. They had chosen to stay, and in that choice, they found forever. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest miracles are not loud or dramatic. Sometimes they come quietly, in the voice of a child, in the kindness of a stranger, in the courage to open a locked heart. If this story touched you, let it remind you of the power of love, forgiveness, and second chances. And if you believe in the magic of stories that heal and inspire, subscribe to the Retold Stories. Because somewhere, in every heart, there is a voice waiting to be heard, a hand waiting to be held, and a story waiting to be retold.